Welcome back. This edition of my little lecture series is going to focus on James Joyce's Ulysses, a very long, complicated, and erudite book that boils down, in a way, to a pretty simple story of a sad marriage, traumatized marriage, you could even say, that has been renewed symbolically by infidelity. Well, why do I say that? Well, first of all, let's establish the sad part. Molly and Leopold Bloom had two children, but only one of them lived. Their older daughter, Millie, is doing fine, but they had a boy, Rudy, who died as an infant. And the book takes place about 11 years after Rudy's death. And at one point, early in the novel, Bloom thinks about sex, as he often does, and says he could never like it again after Rudy. So what he means is, basically, he is uninterested in having normal sexual intercourse with his wife. And in Joyce's world, that is a problem, because Joyce's kind of worldview centers around fertility and the renewal of human life. The novel ends with a long monologue by Molly Bloom, who is kind of the symbol of that fertility, of the life-affirming principle that Joyce wants to uphold. He said at one point, if my book, Ulysses, isn't worth reading, then life isn't worth living. And I think he meant more than just an empty boast by that. But anyway, so Bloom has this kind of aversion to having sex with Molly, which is really rooted in kind of an understandable fear, in a way, that if they did have another child, it might be another, tragedy that they really couldn't handle. They're both, I think, still coping with the loss of this. Molly herself expresses grief about the loss of Rudy. She remembers burying him in a little knitted jacket that she had made herself, and kind of regrets that. But at the time, she thought they weren't going to have any more children after Rudy. So there's the sad part. Now, how does it get renewed through infidelity? Well, basically, what happens over the course of the book is that Molly has a sexual encounter while Bloom is out on his errands, his sort of self-imposed errands, throughout the course of the day. A man named Boylan, Blazes Boylan as he is known, comes to Eccles Street, the Bloom's house, and spends, an hour or so doing various things with Molly. And Bloom himself is well aware that this is going to happen. In fact, he sees Boylan as Boylan is getting ready to go over to visit Molly, and then Bloom is kind of deliberately staying away. Molly even thinks at one point that Bloom has set the whole thing up, that he in some ways wants to have this infidelity happen. And to some extent, she may be right. He certainly knows about this tryst and has basically he's kind of implicitly agreed to it by just absenting himself. Now, we get a clue to why this is happening or how it works to renew the marriage in an episode in which Bloom barely appears. It's the episode in the library known as the Scylla and Charybdis chapter of Ulysses, where Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's kind of autobiographical hero in the book, expounds this long, complicated theory where basically Shakespeare is Hamlet's father, his dead, ghostly father, who is jealous of his brother for sleeping with Shakespeare's wife. And John Eglinton, who's one of Stephen's audience for this performance of a sort of rather bizarre theory, says, "You have come all this way to show us a French triangle? You are a delusion." And in a way, that phrase, "you've come all this way to show us a French triangle," is kind of a microcosm of what Joyce is doing in Ulysses as a whole. The French, of course, have this saying where, marriage is a very difficult thing. It takes three people, the husband, the wife, and the lover. Um, and so anyway, moving on to Molly's monologue, that too is a bit of a microcosm of the novel, because Molly's thoughts wander, just like Ulysses and Bloom himself. They wander around and then come back home to where they truly belong. And her thoughts wander. First, she remembers her encounter with Boylan, but then dismisses him eventually as kind of brutish and vulgar. She also thinks and fantasizes a little bit about Stephen Dedalus, who she remembers when he was a boy. And she, like Leopold Bloom, her husband, kind of thinks of him as almost like a son-like figure for them both. He was certainly young enough to be their son. But then her thoughts turn towards having another child. She thinks that'd be awfully jolly. And then her thoughts immediately go not to Boylan, with whom she's just had the affair, but to her husband. She says, Poldy has more spunk in him. Whatever you want to mean, whatever you think she means by that. But I'm going to suggest that her plan ultimately is to seduce Bloom and to induce him to renew their sexual intercourse with the idea of finally having a child. And this is sort of the end of the book, where she remembers the moment when she agreed to become Bloom's wife. And of course, it's a very famous and beautiful passage. He kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes. Say yes, my mountain flower, and first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. So I think this is not just her remembering what happened in that moment, but also her affirmation that she is going to kind of take the first steps to seducing Bloom. And she knows how Bloom operates. She's well aware also that Bloom himself has had an orgasm during the day. She can smell it on his clothes, and in particular his handkerchief. And she knows Bloom is having some sort of relationship with another woman. She suspects one of his older female friends. Anyway, she knows all about her husband and knows exactly how he operates, and knows exactly how she's going to go about seducing him and renewing their relations in bed. And there's another little clue in one of the first chapters of the book, where Molly's reading kind of a trashy novel, and there's a word in it that she doesn't understand, and the word is metempsychosis. And she asks Bloom, well, what does this word mean? And he tells her, it's the transmigration of souls. And she doesn't understand that either, so she says, oh, rocks, tell us in plain words. Well, and Bloom goes on to explain that it's basically the belief in reincarnation, that one person's soul can go from one body when that body dies and re-inhabit another body. And in a way, I think that's the clue to what needs to happen for the Blooms, right? The soul of Rudy, this boy who has died when he was young, is going to need to be reborn in a new form, in another child, probably a son. Joyce himself had two kids, a boy and a girl. And that's the end to which they're going to work as a couple, is to effect that kind of metempsychosis, transmigration of souls. And there's a very beautiful and sad moment in Ulysses when Bloom himself hallucinates an image of Rudy as an 11-year-old schoolboy. in his little uniform and so forth, and is wonderstruck by this apparition. So I think Joyce is giving us a foretaste, in a way, of what that reincarnated Rudy would look like when he is finally born again into the Bloom's family. Because I don't think Joyce intended Ulysses to be a downer. I think he wanted to give us a positive, life-affirming message. And the reunion of the Blooms, despite the infidelity, is actually kind of faithful to some extent to the story of the Odyssey. Of course, Odysseus, or Ulysses, wanders around for a long time, many years, and then comes back home to Penelope, who's been waiting for him. Of course, she has had to put up with a bunch of suitors, men who want to supplant Odysseus and to marry her. But while she hasn't kind of gotten rid of them fully, she doesn't really want them to be her husband. And Molly is essentially welcoming Bloom back in the same way in Ulysses, right? Even though she's had this affair with Blazes Boylan. And by the way, she, during that last episode of Ulysses, she realizes that her period has started. And so she knows she hasn't gotten pregnant from Boylan, and that it's Bloom that she will welcome finally back into her body, in the same way that Penelope welcomes Odysseus, back into their home when he returns finally from his wanderings. So again, it's a message that echoes the narrative pattern of the Greek myth on which it's based, and it also has that final affirmation, that the Blooms are going to be reunited in this important way. Anyway, thanks for listening.